All right, good afternoon, everyone. This is Jacqueline O'Hara, Community Manager for MISA Ontario, and thank you so much for joining us for day one of the 17th Annual InfoSec Conference and our first virtual InfoSec Conference. We want to welcome today's keynote presentation, CyberCon, Big Tech and Bigger Lies, presented by Dr. James Norrie, CEO of CyberconIQ. This presentation is being brought to you by gold sponsor Digital Boundary Group. Quickly, I'd like to go over some housekeeping notes. So for the Q&A, for the best results, I'm going to recommend everyone maximize their screen within the virtual interface so that you can have the entire presentation taken up on your screen. This is going to give you the best viewing results. And then you can also close it down in the upper right-hand corner. You can enlarge it also in the upper right-hand corner. Please enter your questions in the Q&A that's at the bottom. And we're also recording this session right now. But before we officially start, I would like to share a message from MISA Ontario President Morgan Calvert.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to MISA Ontario's 17th Annual InfoSec Conference. This is our first virtual conference in MISA Ontario history. Hello, everyone. My name is Morgan Calvert, and I'm the President of MISA Ontario and the Director of IT for Middlesex County. As you know, cybersecurity is an extremely important topic when it comes to the transformation of municipal services. It is also an extremely broad topic that has the ability to affect every aspect of our professional and personal lives. The better we can come together to collaborate across cybersecurity initiatives, share information and experiences, and to leverage our collective knowledge, skills, and abilities, the more resilient our municipalities and our communities can be in the face of digital transformation. I'd like to take a quick moment to thank our sponsors, our vendor partners within our community, for their support of this event. I encourage you over the next 2 afternoons to visit our sponsors in the virtual exhibit hall to learn more about the latest security solutions and capabilities that are available to us. Also, please join the MISA Hunt for your opportunity to win great prizes throughout the conference. I would also like to encourage you to interact and share with each other by going to the networking tab of the conference platform. I hope that you can make the best of the next 2 afternoons, and I can only hope to see everyone live at next year's conference in Guelph, Ontario. I'll now pass it over to one of our sponsors, Brian Parr of Digital Boundary Group, to introduce our keynote speaker. Thanks, everyone, and take it away, Brian.
Hey, Morgan, thanks a lot for the intro. Welcome, everybody, to MISA InfoSec this year. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. James Norrie, author, founder, and CEO of CyberconIQ, and professor of cybersecurity and strategy at York College of Pennsylvania. His work focuses on how cybercriminals exploit our instincts and impulses into global multi-billion-dollar crime as a service industry, why we need a different approach to keep ourselves safer online. Dr. Norrie will demonstrate how assessing our human nature is the most valuable tactic of counterbalance employee vulnerability, with the goal of changing the worldwide conversation about cybersecurity from fear to hope. We welcome Dr. Norrie as we journey into the intersection of behavioral science and cybersecurity best practice. Dr. Norrie.
Well, thank you and welcome to our keynote today. I'm absolutely delighted to be here, and I hail from York, Pennsylvania currently. However, I want to be clear, I am a fellow Northern Canadian, my home and native land, which I miss very much, but I now live down here. And so I'm coming to you from York, PA, and today our session is called 4 Cues for You, and I hope to take you on a journey that demonstrates the intersection of cybersecurity and behavioral science. And I hope that you will find today's topic both stimulating, thought-provoking, and especially valuable in a time of increasing threat. So let's dive into our topic for today. We'll have a chance for questions and comments at the end. Partway through, we have a little gift for you, thanks to MISA, who has arranged for all of you to be able to participate today by doing the assessment tool. So we'll have a chance to do that about partway through. So our agenda for today in the keynote is very simple. I want to identify what's changing about cybersecurity, and more particularly, perhaps what is not changing about cybersecurity. We are all now deeply embedded in the implications of COVID-19, and it's clear that that creates a new set of risk exposures and boundaries for organizations. So I want to look at the degree to which that particular problem, which is based in technology and human behavior, might change our instincts, our cues, and our clues about how we operate and what that might mean in this new environment that is going to be with us, I think, now for some time. And then we're going to finish by exploring how that new knowledge can improve organizational compliance and risk outcomes. We are very interested here at CyberCon in helping you drive your risk and compliance culture. It is particularly clear that's important in the public sector. You are a target-rich environment, and there are a lot of people who would like to hurt you and harm you. So hopefully much of what we talk about today will be of interest to all of you in the roles that you have in your respective organizations. So this is based on my book, which is there. You see a cover of it. And the title, I think, provocatively, is Protecting Ourselves from Big Tech and Bigger Lies. And the primary thesis of the book is simple. I do not actually believe that we can solve the present technology problem with more technology. In fact, it's anti-intuitive to me that the problems created by technology haven't created a whole additional set of human problems that we sometimes tend to either forget or downplay because they're not predictable in the same way that technology problems are. We enjoy as cybersecurity professionals, I think, for the most part, the challenge of dealing with technology because it is something we can control to a large extent. It is within our boundary and our perimeter, and we have some ability to influence outcomes predictably. The human factor is much less predictable. And as a result of that, I think it's worthy of some time and attention today, perhaps in a different way than you might have thought about it before. So I would suggest that the problem we want to tackle is the growing complexity of that human element, and that really we're not dealing with anything that's terribly different technologically in COVID, and I'll come to that in just a second, but that the sheer scale of what we're facing does create enhanced risk of third-party inspired attacks, and particularly those that can damage your reputation and lead to economic loss. The proof of that, and these are US statistics, but the same trend, by the way, applies in Canada. We have seen an astounding increase over the last 5 years, a trend line of solid 16 quarters of growth in both the likely cost of a probable attack and the probability of that attack occurring. We've also seen a startling statistic start to emerge and that you can see the source thereof, that about 70% now of successful cyber attacks involve some sort of human element or deception as opposed to brute force technology attacks. If we particularly turn our attention to the fact that in Q2 of this year, so the current FBI data suggests that in the first full COVID quarter, that was the one that ran essentially after the shutdown in March through April, May, and June, that in that April, May, and June period, we saw a 230% increase in both the volume of threats and close to a doubling of the number of successful cybersecurity attacks aimed at organizations. So we are clearly in a period of increasing threat volume, and some of that has to do with this particular pattern. I would suggest that the shutdown, which forced most of us into a scale of working from home, did not present any particularly novel or new, and excuse the pun, novel, intended, technology issues from the novel coronavirus itself. And I would debate that the phrase working from home is really where we're at. Maybe more, we're all living at work. The high distractibility, the integration of our work lives and our workplaces with our homes creates an interesting impact psychologically that is maybe not taken into account when we think about the technology. We have the ability to use VPNs and to tunnel safely and to use encryption, at rest and in motion. And we have all of the technical ability and have been dealing with working from home for some time. We've also been dealing with the bring your own device to work phenomenon, something that many of us struggled with initially, but we've mastered most of that. So the attack surface itself has remained stable. But let's think about something. As work is no longer a destination, we don't go to work necessarily, or when work is not performed uniquely inside a perimeter of an office or a set of facilities that are belonging to physically and technologically to the organization. What does that mean? Well, for many workers, what it means, and it's intriguing to think about, is that the cues and clues that they use when they're working are those derived from being at home, not at work. And when work is no longer a destination, but a flow, when work is an activity, something we do, and we intersperse it and intermix it with all the other activities that are going on around us in the household, there is clearly a new problem. And that psychological problem, that impact, is that the cues and clues of working at home are not the same as working. And as a result of that, even though we are working at home, that is, we are doing workflows at home, we are not necessarily in our work persona. And this becomes very, very interesting. And as we get a little further along in the keynote, you'll begin to understand why I would suggest that this sudden scale of working from home has created some challenges, not just on the technical front, or perhaps not even so much on the technical front as it has on the psychological. Now, to locate ourselves in this problem, I want to use a very specific Canadian example. So all of you would be quite familiar with Huawei, and particularly probably with the court cases that are making the news quite frequently that are ongoing in BC Supreme Court. And this is the very simple issue that on a request from the US government, Canada arrested and proceeded to extradite the CFO of Huawei, a Chinese national company, to the US to face prosecution for apparent crimes related to the embargo of telecommunications technology, sanctions related to the Middle East. Now, what is so intriguing about this is it has shifted Canada, and I want to be really clear about this geopolitical framework for a second, because we sometimes forget about this. So cyber is not, of course, a national problem. It is an international problem. And the point at which Canada respected its long-standing extradition treaty with the United States and acted properly legally to do what it needed to do, it engaged China in a way that we had not done in previous decades. And that is, we became an adversary because we were seen as an instrument of US policy. Now, there's a perfect example of how geopolitics impacts each and every one of you and your organizations today, where I would have suggested prior to Huawei that being in Canada generally decreased the risk of what we call nation state activity. I would suggest, at least in the Canadian context, that is perhaps no longer true with China, the first country on that list. So let's go through this framework and understand it together. First off, I would suggest that the nation states that are most egregiously involved in cybersecurity shenanigans, as we call it professionally, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, all have slightly different objectives, but they relate to the distribution or the accretion of power to the nation. And one of the interesting things about this is if you live in the United States or Canada or the UK, something like that, you can't really imagine your government having a connection to private industry. Could you imagine if in your municipality you were tasked with somehow working directly with local companies and engaged in a way that was perhaps seen as inappropriate? I can't imagine. Probably neither can you. But you should imagine on the other side that these countries all have a particular agenda. And that particular agenda in the case of those four countries is to create disruption, seek power. In the case of China, it's theft of intellectual property for gain. Sometimes it's shaming. But you should be aware that they are aware that the infrastructures of many parts of government, from federal through provincial and of course down into municipal, are at risk because you are under-resourced. And as a result of being under-resourced, you face risk of exploitation that is somewhat easier for nation states because they have virtually unlimited resources. So imagine that first stovepipe, that first column is a group of people with unlimited resources. In the case of the Chinese, let me suggest that they have 10,000 incredibly well-trained software engineers that are full-time employees of the state whose sole mission is to hack into global systems around the world and steal stuff that they're instructed to locate. So we have the issue of nation states and what that does and our position in the world and how the political vibe of what's going on in the present tense. In the United States right now, of course, as you would all know, being our near northern neighbor, it is election season. And in the interests of being transparent, I don't want to turn this into a political debate with you, but I would suggest that the partisan issues are significant fodder for the Russians. They have the incredible ability to disrupt our democracy currently as a result of the very partisan nature of what's going on in the country itself. So each of those nation states is different, but that first stovepipe is something for you to be aware of. And if you've never thought about this, you might want to think about the fact that your organization or your municipality's security may have a lot more to do with international affairs than you ever imagined. Now let's move to crime as a service. Crime as a service is a growing business because in this particular case, I've listed some of the folks that are there. As an example, RBN, which stands for the Russian Business Network, is hardly that at all. RBN is actually a highly organized, very sophisticated crime gang that looks and feels like any large enterprise, any place in the world. It has human resources functions responsible for managing employees and paying employees and hiring new criminals. It has all kinds of groups of people in technology. It can hire the best psychologists and sociologists. It has an incredible infrastructure around finances to process all of the ransomware that it gets in and to transfer Bitcoin into local currencies and to hide it. It's truly an astoundingly sophisticated company. Well, or organization, because it's not really a company because its primary purpose is crime. And one of the things that it does is it extracts between $1 and $1.5 billion a month. Let me just repeat that. $1 to $1.5 billion a month from the US economy straight into the Russian hands. So that's that middle crime. Call it crime as a service. Now, what worries me a little bit is as quickly as we are able to help you gain more knowledge of and defenses against whatever the latest threats are, the bad guys are probably getting the new technology and the new techniques even quicker than we are. They are well funded and they have incredible resources to invest in new exploitive technologies, perhaps more money to exploit us than we have to defend ourselves. So again, it's important to understand that on the scope and scale of what's going on nationally, you could find yourselves caught up in crime as a service ever so easily. And that's because criminals always hunt for the easy access. You probably learned this when you were buying your first house somewhere. Somebody always said, don't look like the best house on the street. Make sure you lock your door, have an alarm system. Don't make it easy. Fix all the low-hanging fruit security risks because a thug, a burglar, is going to look for the easiest house to break into. Well, similarly, these crime as a service entities are looking for the easiest corporation or entity to hack. So if you fall on the low end of low-hanging fruit, then you are going to attract more interest from them. In fact, there are entire bulletin boards in the dark web that feature organizations that have already been hacked easily, shared the secrets of how they were hacked, in an attempt to sell that information to other crime as a service gangs to make you even more of a target once you've been hacked once. So for those of you in the audience today who have had an attack, please be aware that that is one of the singular most important indicators of risk for you, that if you've been hacked once, you are generally going to get hacked again. And then, of course, the last column, the last stovepipe, the opportunists. These are folks who seek fame, fantasy, or fortune. Hackers, crackers, hacktivists, white hats, black hats, you name it. I do want to tell you today, it's rarely true that the hacks that you're experiencing are a couple of kids in a basement trying to prove a point. It just doesn't happen anymore. And we've in fact turned hacking into a part of what we do. I find it quite ironic that I am at this particular keynote. I have been sponsored by a company that does social penetration testing, and I want to thank Brian for his introduction. It was really great. But what's so interesting is he would tell you that there's a certification. Certified ethical hackers, people who are actually trained how to use criminal hacking activities with permission of organizations to actually test penetration. So these are the kinds of things that maybe don't always occur to us, but I'm hoping after today they will occur to us, because it's important to locate your organization along the risk profile of what's happening geopolitically, the kinds of threats that are active and real in the marketplace today, and to understand that this is not random anymore. So what is a public sector CISO to do? Well, I would suggest to you that there's a simple formula, 3 parts of this that I think are now endemic to your roles. And whether you are the CISO or whether you are a middle-level employee, whether you are working inside municipal government or whether you aspire to move around inside government, I would suggest that the entire public sector needs to be aware that everything they do today has to reduce the probability of a successful cyber attack. It has to reduce the total costs of a successful cyber attack when it occurs. Notice I say when, not if. And I know that I'm talking to an experienced audience that understands this, but it is important to realize that we cannot eliminate cyber risk. The probability will never fall to 0. Therefore, the risk of a successful attack always exists. And so one of the things we forget is to not only focus on intrusion and preventing those attacks from happening in the first instance, but it's also what do we do in the interests of recovery, speedy speedy decision making? For instance, have you modeled incident response with your team? Do you have the right kinds of policy and frameworks in place to respond? Do you understand what you would do? Have you got crash teams? Do you carry cyber insurance? There are a host of questions in that middle cost bucket that are anticipatory, designed to help you when and if that attack does happen. And we do all this by advancing our compliance culture. It is the fact that we want a cyber aware culture. We must also, as a profession, stop slinging fear. I think we've slung fear for too long. And even as we do this, and we're focusing on the human element, if we use fear, you're going to find out in just a few minutes how absolutely devastating that can be, because it changes the psychology of how your employees think. And fear as a biological condition is not necessarily a positive one. So I'll come back to that whole advancing the compliance culture near the end of my session today. So let's dive into the solution, because it's already depressing enough to think about the problem. It seems almost insurmountable, but it's not. We can approach cybersecurity then as questions of psychology and sociology and organizational behavior instead of purely technology. We can link what we do, and we can turn cybersecurity into a team sport. And that's a line we use a lot at CyberconIQ. We really are interested in what we can do to help make sure that your entire organization deeply and sustainably is aware of and focused on the things that they can do under their control to give you a leg up in protecting you from the problem that we have just described. So let's look at this in a different way. I think it's entirely clear that everybody learns very early in life to look both ways before they cross the street. And we may train our children in different circumstances in different ways to do this in different situations. So, example, we may have to teach them how not to give in to an impulse or an instinct when they're playing in the front yard and they kick a ball or drop something out on the street, not to dash out in the street and pick it up. That's a more urgent limitation of impulse. Or we might teach them as a habit, right? We want something to become habitual. So we constantly remind our young children, we stop at the corner, we look at the color of the signal, we look both ways before we cross the street. That's called habituation. So there are different ways that we do this. And if you're a parent in the audience today and you're thinking about your children, then you understand exactly what I mean when I say we have to similarly develop our employees' cyber psyche. Now, not as a parent to child, not quite the same thing, but in a similar way, we have to make good cyber hygiene, good cyber behavior as natural as looking both ways before we cross the street. And this, of course, ties to psychology. And it ties to something very particular in psychology called the psychology Big Five. So around the 1930s, the primary part of psychology that involved personality was dominated by Freudian psychology. You may have studied this as a college kid, perhaps. The id and the superego and the ego and the psychosocial stages of development. And they're all a lot of fun to talk about, but they aren't particularly insightful, actually, into our behavior. So a very famous American psychologist, Gordon Allport, through the late 40s, 50s, and early 60s at Harvard, basically invented trait-based personality theory. And he took what was a very complex question, which is, why are we all personally different? And he gave us a language. And so any of you who've done Myers-Briggs as an example, or DISC or colors, and some of you may use these tools in your organizations. You may use them for selection or for management development. Perhaps you use them for team building. So out of this, over time, has come a very stable set of behaviors that make up most of our personality. And the way our personality is made up controls many of our base instincts and our impulses in terms of our behavior. And again, if you have more than one child at home, you understand this. You can have two children who are biologically related who have very different personalities. Well, the same thing is true of all of us. And all of us also have a slightly different instinct and impulse at work than we perhaps do at home. This returns us to this earlier question I put on the table of what is really the impact of working from home or living at work in COVID? And the answer is we are merging kind of distinct personalities. Our sort of workplace personality now suddenly becomes our home personality, and they're sort of commingling. So I want to point out that this particular approach to psychology has no objective truth. It's very difficult to prove. It's proven only in perception, or what we call theory without a proof. It lies outside the boundaries of traditional scientific method, but we know it works because anybody who's done some of these is usually quite impressed with how well the language of the test or the framework gives them information about themselves. So now for our gift. We want you to know your style and know your risk. So right now we're going to pause in our keynote and have a little fun. We're going to have all of the participants that are on the call with the opportunity to go out and use a code, and this code will give you a free assessment. We are actually going to be able to get you to experience what it's like to do the particular CyberconIQ assessment tool. It's called MyQ, and it's very easy. It's about 40 questions. It only takes about 8 or 10 minutes. So I would invite you while you're there to open a device of your choice and to put in that URL and that code and your name and your email, and I will email you back a read of your online cybersecurity profile. And I think that this will be a little bit of fun for us all. Now, if for some reason you can't or don't want to do this today, or you perhaps can't arrange to get in because of restrictions on your systems or your workplace, I would invite you to take a screenshot of this. We will leave this code open for a few days so you can go at your leisure and do this. But right now, I think we've got a few participants who are going to turn on their mics. So Jacqueline, I think you're going to connect me to Abe and Ron and Wendy and Wellesley. And I think we're going to experience a little bit of chit chat in the background while you all go to concentrate on doing your test. And it should take you no more than 8 or 10 minutes.
Yes, currently we actually have one Q&A question right now, and the question is this a test?
What a great question. Whoever gave me that question, thank you. Well, it's not really a test because there are no right or wrong answers, as in many psychological instruments. It's actually an assessment, and it's particularly not a clinical diagnostic. It is a developmental diagnostic. So what's important is this is not going to find somebody in your organization who is deliberately trying to be, for instance, disloyal or criminal, or somebody who's clinically not well. It is a developmental psychology tool. So all it will return, I promise, is a very non-invasive view of your cybersecurity profile. All right, so who have we got on the line with us whose mics are open, Jacqueline? Have we got Abe or Ron or Wendy?
I've just given Wendy permission to talk. So Wendy, you can unmute yourself when you're ready.
Hi, Wendy.
Oh, she might still be on mute. I'll also allow April Towns to talk.
Hey, April.
Hi, James.
How are you?
I'm good.
Excellent. Did you manage to get into the assessment?
I am in the assessment. I am 25% complete.
Great. Well, a couple of things you might notice. So first of all, you've picked up that there's a little indicator there that tells you how far along you are. And you'll notice something interesting, April, if you haven't already. Notice that it's a 6-point Likert scale. Do you see that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, isn't that frustrating?
Yes, very.
It is, because it drives you, and as the rest of you are doing this, it drives you to either mild or strong agreement or disagreement with every particular item on the assessment. And that is because we have something as a human, we have a trait called central mean tendency. If we give you a midpoint, you will tend to pick it, won't you, April?
Yes, I would.
Okay, so that's what we're trying to avoid. So that is known as test architecture, and we have studied test architecture and best practices in educational assessments and adult pedagogy. So one of the things we do is force that. How are you finding the questions? Pretty easy?
Yeah, in general.
Good.
Nothing too tiresome to my brain.
Good, and nothing technical, notice.
Correct.
Right. So what we are doing is we are attempting to read people's impulses and instincts that are at a personality level that are not actually based on your knowledge of cybersecurity at all. So back to the person who posed the question about test, this is not at all particularly about getting questions right or wrong about cybersecurity practices, because that's not what this is about. And then also, at what point of completion are you now, April?
38. I'm slowing down because I'm doing two things at once.
And I'm going to stop talking in a second. But so what most of you will notice is as you go, you're going to get a little more thoughtful. So I encourage you just to keep going with your first instincts. So we'll let April return to her work. Thank you, April, for all those comments. And back to your assessment.
Thank you.
And I don't know whether Wendy turned on her mic or not.
No, it looks like Wendy is still on mute.
Okay.
But I did do the test earlier with you.
Ah, and how did you find it, Jacqueline?
I would echo April's thoughts, but when I actually got the results, I was actually very impressed with
Okay, cool.
what I received.
Okay. Well, I will encourage people as you get to the end of the assessment, some of you are already going to get there. You may feel free to skip the explanatory videos because you won't need that because you have learned or are going to learn much more about this approach to cybersecurity during our keynote. So you may feel free to skip the videos and just carry on with the test. And then when you get to the end of the test, it will return a particular style that I will explain in just a few minutes. So if you get there first, just hang on for the rest of us.
So we have a couple more questions coming in. First one
Sure.
is, will the recording be available after? And yes, it will. The next question we have here is this like Myers-Briggs, this questionnaire?
Well, and I don't know who asked that, but that's another great question. You heard me make reference to Myers-Briggs. Myers-Briggs was the first trait-based personality theory inventory to come into existence. Now back in the 50s, it began actually. So if you've done Myers-Briggs before, you may think about this as Myers-Briggs for cybersecurity. The reason that Myers-Briggs won't work, I tested it actually. I started with Myers-Briggs and DISC and other existing personality assessments. The reason they don't work very well is that they're attempting to read too many dimensions of the psychology big five. They're actually taking what we call a comprehensive view. And I am particularly focusing and extracting 2 dimensions and leaving a couple on the table that don't particularly matter to your online behavior. So one of the things that doesn't matter to online behavior is extroversion and introversion as an example. So we're leaving some elements of the total personality deliberately out of the assessment to make it both simpler and more focused on questions of cybersecurity and the risk and reward trade-offs that your employees make while they're online.
Excellent. And we have another question here asking, what's going to happen with the data that people are participating with the survey?
What?
Should we expect a zillion marketing
No.
emails? Putting you on the spot.
Please do. Well, you're welcome to put me on the spot. So 2 very quick things. First of all, we never ever share that information externally ever. But here's the interesting thing, and we get this question quite a bit. Of course, our system has gone through lots of due diligence because we already have got public sector customers and clients, and you may imagine they've put us through the privacy and technology safety drill, which is good for us. So you are in a persistent connection with the IBM cloud as we speak, all of you, and we are not actually recording your answers to the test. So were you to abandon the test, we would not actually be able to restore you to where you were because we aren't tracking your individual answers. And that's a very important point. We're not actually interested and we don't care about your individual answers to the items. Our test management system, our TMS, is watching for your pattern of responses. And some of you who are some of the way through will have already seen something called intercorrelation. It'll actually start serving up questions that seem to be repetitive in some ways. This is testing you for both a random pattern of answers, but also establishing the validity of the underlying response pattern as it relates to a particular quadrant of the assessment. So you're seeing some interesting behavior. And then once you are done, that session will be closed and it's considered an ephemeral session. So we will keep none of the information except for one thing, which is your actual style, which we will email back to you, and it will be encrypted and ciphered. So it'll be encrypted both at rest and in motion to you. And then the second thing is we cipher it. We never actually associate your particular style in open text. It's always ciphered. So we never have your open text style associated with your personal information. So even were we hacked, they would be unable to, or without a whole lot of effort, be able to actually uncipher the text and put it into plain text. So we are very aware of that. And I appreciate the question very much.
Excellent, thank you. If anyone else would like to put in any challenging questions, make sure you put them in the Q&A. We are answering all of them. If anyone has finished the assessment, feel free to raise your hand if you want to share any input about that.
Right. And April, if April would turn on her mic. April, where are you at in the assessment?
I am complete.
Ooh, good for you. Well, that took you 7 minutes, so good for you. So that was even a little bit below 8. And April, what style, dare I ask, are you?
I am moderate.
Moderate what? Risk?
Risk tolerant and rule breaking.
Risk tolerant and rule breaking. Ooh, you're a moderate risk maker then. Is that what you
Yes.
are?
Sorry.
Yes. Very good. Well, April, I have news for you.
Yeah. Yes.
We share a style, and that will become very evident in the content to follow. So, all right. Well, I appreciate you. We're going to put you back on mute. Thanks so much. But wait,
Thank you.
because you're going to have a chance to learn more about your style in a second. And Jacqueline, what do you think? We're coming up on 8 minutes, so maybe we'll let the folks carry on. Have you had very many? Can you see people's hands? Do they know that they're sort of mostly finished if people have gotten through the assessment?
Taking a look. Oh, they're coming in now. Yep, we see some more hands coming up. Excellent, people. Excellent.
Good. All right, so if you're still focusing on just wrapping up the assessment, then you can keep doing that for a minute or two. It shouldn't take you that much longer. I don't know, are there any more questions there you want to address, Jacqueline, before we move on to the rest of our content?
So we actually had a follow-up question from April asking, knowing how you're placed, how does that affect my cybersecurity outlook? So April
That's what
marks
we're
as
going
a
to cover
moderate.
we are going to cover that in just a second. I will say that there are 2 expressions of behavior in each quadrant. So there are actually 8 styles. You can be moderate or strong. So you, like Myers-Briggs, you are either further out, or DISC, if any of you've done DISC, you're either further out to the outside of the quadrant or closer to the middle. There is some research that suggests that the more job experience and life experience you have, the more likely you are to be a more moderated style. That's just because we've learned to make our instincts somewhat more under our control. So that's a normal part of experience generally. But everybody is going to be either a moderate or strong expression of one of the 4 quadrants when they're done.
Perfect, thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Well, I think with seeing all those hands, Jacqueline, maybe we will move forward with our content. What do you think? Because we are now at minute 9.5.
Yes, time to move on.
Time to move
you.
on. So, well, and we hope you appreciate our gift, and I'll come back at the end to tell you what it does mean in terms of training in just a second. But let's just spend a few minutes. So, April, if you would turn on your mic again for me, that would be great. Because if you don't mind, you and I are going to have a little dialogue as we go.
Okay.
There's April. All right, April. So we're going to begin in the polar opposite to you and I. We are going to begin down in that bottom left quadrant with our risk breakers. Now, if you wish to out yourselves, you can feel free to flash your little hands on the galley so that people can see if you are in the particular quadrant. And if you wish to keep it secret, you may keep it a secret. There are 2 things about these quadrants that are interesting that you'll discover. One is, by having your whole organization do the assessment, you get a psychological effect called sensitization. So April, when you were going through that particular assessment and you and I were talking about cybersecurity, your natural curiosity was, how does this affect my online behavior, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's exactly the effect. That's called sensitization. Now, do you have a partner, or are you married, April, by chance?
Yes, sir, I am.
Okay, so you say that with some reluctance, I noticed, but I will point out, April, that if you've ever done one of those quizzes online where are you and your partner, destined to be together forever? Have you ever done any of those kinds of things, or are you a good match? Have you ever done any of those kinds of things?
Sure.
Yeah, well, the effect called sensitization is the instant you do that with your partner sitting on a couch. So there you are, innocently sitting there, and suddenly you go ahead and you do a test like this. And we all know that this is heading to a conversation that the other person does not want to have, because in the instant that you do that assessment, we now have language with which we are expected to describe our lifelong marriage or the tragedy of future divorce. And so it is so fascinating for me that you get a completely organization-wide elevation of awareness of cybersecurity just by having people playfully go through this assessment. So let's do this. The people who are down in that bottom left corner, risk breakers, you love order and structure and compliance with rules. You don't like to break rules. You make very, very good public sector employees, by the way, because you're very compliant with all of those important procedures, policies, and frameworks that we put in place. So what's intriguing about you is I'm going to use a pop example of IKEA furniture. So let me tell you how you assemble IKEA furniture, risk breakers. You open the box when you get it home, you reach for the instruction manual. And the first step of the instruction manual says, count and sort the hardware, usually by letter. And then you promptly count and sort the hardware. Now, April, I already hear you laughing into your microphone. You and I couldn't imagine doing that, could we, April?
No.
No, we're not going to do that. And you're going to find out why, folks. But I am going to tell you this. The reason that you do that is because the rules say count and sort. So that's what you're going to do. So in cybersecurity terms, you are very easy to train with current generic rule-based cybersecurity training. And I might point out that the vast majority of people who have cybersecurity awareness training programs in place, and I'm hoping that that is most of you. If you don't, then I'm hoping this particular keynote will convince you to do that. But what I do know is that almost all of what most people put into cybersecurity awareness training is a set of rules. And because this particular quadrant, which by the way, represents in most organizations about 38 to 40% of your head count, they work really well with the existing way they're trained because that's the way they think. Now let me explain what makes them vulnerable. So you might understand cybersecurity as preying on people's particular strengths taken to taken over the top, become a weakness. So in these particular employees' case, the attack vector that's working the best right now that will produce an over 90% hit rate in this quadrant is a deep fake of somebody in authority telling them to break the rules or chastising them for not having followed the rules. This will instantly cause that very strength of following the rules to become a vulnerability. So we can translate how you assemble IKEA furniture into how you behave and the vulnerabilities you have to particular cybersecurity attacks. Now let's move up to risk takers. Again, I can't see the galley, but Jacqueline, maybe you can poll people. So if you feel like you want to out yourself, we've got any risk takers in the room, you can put up your little hand and let us know. That should be a much smaller number of people, actually. So it's not nearly as prevalent a style. It'll be in most organizations somewhere around 12 to 15%, as much as 17 or 18 in some. But you'll get a large number of folks who are just a little more risk tolerant. So they really still want to be rule compliant. So they want to stay on that side of rule following, but they're more risk tolerant. And as a result of being risk tolerant, they're prepared to make selective exceptions to the rules. So when they come to IKEA Furniture, April, they too are reaching for the instruction manual. So they're not us. They're reaching for the instruction manual. And the first step says count, sort the hardware. And they promptly say, no, you know what? I'll take a calculated risk that somebody else has already done that. And by doing that, they move on to step 2. So in cybersecurity terms, these folks are interesting. They too are a little easier to train. They still do fairly well with generic training in cybersecurity awareness that's rule-based. However, there are some things that they need to be particularly aware of that they're vulnerable to. This includes adding urgency or emergency that unsettles that normally careful calculus of the trade-offs that they do, or particular situations where there's an outsized reward or risk attached to behavior, because this will cause them to be vulnerable. And so examples of things there are the fake customer invoice, fake returns, some of that stuff, fake kidnapping videos, which are terrifying. It shows this is a machine generated now. It's done by AI. They capture social engineering information about you from the social media footprints of your family. They take a picture of your child and make it look like your child is being put into the back of a white van parked in front of your house with a hood put over them. So I can tell you that some of it is quite terrifying. Now, April, you and I, here we are. We get the IKEA box home. What do?
We chuck it.
Yeah, get rid of the box and we just start assembling furniture, don't we? There is no set of instruction manuals we need. We might keep a picture, right? Maybe, April. Maybe we're going off the picture. Maybe, right? Exactly.
We're probably smarter than that.
Well, exactly. So that's what we often think. And I'm going to tell you, so when the bookcase turns into a T-card, April, something else about our particular style is we will also have a tendency to claim that's what the manufacturer intended. So April, let me tell you about yourself and let me see how I do. So you've come to trust your instincts and personal judgment. It served you really well. You're probably somebody who's innovative, creative. You might be pushing organizational change in the boundaries of what the organization is normally expecting. So this is what this quadrant does. And by the way, all quadrants are valuable and all quadrants are vulnerable. What makes April and I distinct up in this quadrant, and if you're joining us, you would be smiling and laughing probably as I'm describing this, is rule-based training doesn't work so well for us. So some tactics we might do, April, it's time for our typical quarterly or annual training. Might you turn on the video, turn off the sound, and then fake your way through the quiz? You wouldn't do that, would you, April?
Never.
Never, right? Sure. So with that, April, I'm going to go to another style, but I really want to thank you. You were a great sport today. If we were in an audience, we'd be giving you applause, but Zoom applause looks weird because people clap and you just can't see them. You know, it's like really weird. So anyway, thank you very much. We're going to mute you and send you back to the audience. But if you ever want to explore more your style, just get in touch. And
Thank you.
thank you so much. That was great. And so we understand those folks as having a very high degree of trust in their team. So people who are risk makers very much trust their teams. And as a result of that trust, they are easily compromised through what we call affiliative attacks, man in the middle, fake people from social organizations or clubs or professional organizations that they're particularly involved with. They're very prone to scams around careers and LinkedIn exploitation and some other things. So we understand quite a bit about that quadrant and how they're vulnerable. And then down to our risk shakers, there's again going to be a few of those. By the way, risk makers are in most organizations a slightly higher or lower percentage of risk takers. It has to do whether you're in the private or public sector, actually. So in the public sector, it'd be slightly lower. In the private sector, it'd be slightly higher. And in risk shakers down in the bottom right corner, these are folks who enjoy the autonomy to choose when they break the rules. So they like to be a bit surreptitious, a bit covert about when they break the rules. They like to get away. They get a sensation from getting away with breaking the rules and not being detected. This makes them incredibly vulnerable to certain kinds of attack vectors right now that are extraordinarily dangerous for organizations. In case you haven't heard about it, I'm probably the only keynote speaker in the entire history of MISA that can use the word porn and mean it. So the number one thing, the vector there that's working is called porn shaming. And if you haven't heard of it, you will. This involves loading an illegal or salacious pornographic image into a hacked download file that makes it look like your user has been accessing porn. These particular folks have a wonderful trait that the organization benefits from. They're great problem solvers. They like to disassemble problems into their component parts, and that's a good thing. And as they're doing that, they always want to be aware of what they're dealing with before they start dealing with it. So they may have forgotten about whether they did this, or they may be suspicious or not, but they're going to find out. And instead of that first call being HR or IT to deal with the problem, they're already on the slippery slope of the attack. So that's a little bit about the four quadrants and the particular quadrant you find yourself in. So our particular goal would then be to use that information. Now remember, this has no objective truth to it. So for all of you who did the assessment, what you probably found intriguing is that you probably found a lot of resonance in the description, right? It resonated with you. It made sense. We call that in psychology, capital R, self-reported reliability. That is, it's only important that you agree with where you landed in the quadrants and that the description makes some difference for you. Because what we're now going to go about doing is applying that knowledge in action. And the way it strengthens your cybersecurity program is following on the heels of the elevated sensation, right? The sensitization effect, the elevated knowledge of cybersecurity as a personal trait. We now tip them into very specific training about why they're vulnerable to certain kinds of threats. But we do not ever want to train people on the content of a threat. We want to focus ourselves entirely on the context of a threat. The context of the vulnerability is because of your personality. What we've discovered is the rate at which people fall prey to random phishing attacks is not random at all. And in fact, it's highly predictable in our world because I can actually script a particular kind of phishing attack that will work for each of the quadrants. I can practically force people, because of their vulnerabilities that are so instinctive, that are really at a base around their particular personality, that this is a distinct way of looking at cybersecurity that does not involve actual technology knowledge or knowledge of the content itself. It has to do with knowledge of ourselves. And we've studied this quite carefully. Now, most of you have excellent cyber hygiene. Cyber hygiene is going to keep most payloads that are dangerous outside the perimeter of your organization. You're going to use all your endpoint security and your secure email gateways and all the stuff that you're used to using today. Because if you looked at that formula, that particular way of looking at that equation down below, we call this the pathway to compromise. Unless the actual payload is in front of your employees, you've managed to defeat the first one of those conditions. That is, the delivery method was frustrated. We did not actually get the payload in. I will tell you that no matter how good your cyber hygiene, most organizations can filter out to a maximum of about 92 or 93%. That's 7 or 8% left. And some of you may be down as high as 15 or 20%. So that's a very important percentage on a growing volume of threats. And I would argue you will never get that to zero. There's always going to be some unknown code snippet, some malicious code, some ransomware, some virus that is going to be unknown to your systems that is going to be in front of your employee. So the next part of our equation is, are they vulnerable to the delivery context? And that's where we come in with this new knowledge, right? You can, as a CISO, help educate people on why their particular impulses and instincts online are making them either safer or not, and what they can do about that. How can we make them not afraid, but aware? And by training not with fear, but with some form of enthusiasm for them becoming part of the solution, we reduce the fact that they are likely to be vulnerable in a way that they don't understand. Now, we'll never get it to zero, but we will do a heck of a lot better than generic training, because this is customized and personalized. We call this curated for the benefit of the learner. And then in the last instance, can we prevent an action? Now, there was a devastating attack here in the city of Baltimore. Some of you may have heard about one of the worst hit of 22 municipalities last spring down here. And the attack was perpetuated through ransomware, and a 26-year veteran of the city, a female employee, who reported after during the investigation, she said, "I knew with a sinking feeling in my heart as soon as I clicked that something was wrong." The problem is she realized it after she clicked. And I'm not blaming her, because this is very common. This is what the cyber criminals want to do. And that crime as a service stovepipe that we looked at earlier, this is exactly what they count on. So you have to make it actually okay to be vulnerable around cybersecurity in your organization. And to do that, you don't want to sling fear and the fear of consequences. And I would argue that for most of you, as you go through doing your phishing attacks, perhaps that's catching people doing something wrong. And is that really helping? So instead of reporting failure rates, report pass rates, and talk about how we're going to use this to bolster people's understanding of cybersecurity as a team sport. Because if at that point of action you can prevent them from executing on the attack, then you can't be compromised. So we understand a lot about that. Now, I know this is motherhood for all of you, and I really want to acknowledge this as we begin to move towards our close. Cybersecurity cannot be looked at as a one-time event. This is about deliberate and ongoing process. And again, cyber hygiene, the technology part of this, is part of this. But what are you doing to keep it top of mind for your employees? What is it you're doing to build a deep, capable, cyber-aware culture? And now, particularly as we get to that last part of what I said to you, a public sector CISO has to worry about, it's not just reducing the probability of an attack and not just reducing the costs if they occur. It's being a player in the corporate culture. And it's crossing over the aisle to your HR and OD functions and to other parts of various elements of your organization to help turn this into a culture conversation. And this is so important. We need to move away from the idea that this is technology and move towards the fact that it's human. And I'll present this just as an example. This is from banking. But this particular approach, the idea that we are customizing our cybersecurity awareness training and all the things we do, driving cultural awareness at a personal level, means that we're making the organization better off one person at a time. And there is no point in doing training if it doesn't change on the job behavior. And one of the ways we know it changes on the job behavior is the case studies. And the case studies show us that people are retaining more of this information for a longer period of time because it's being curated and personalized to them. We also focus in order in the training on the threats that are most vulnerable by quadrant. So people see an instant connection between them and how they're being trained. Not what they're being trained, how they're being trained. And this is distinctly different. And of course, a lot of this means you get fewer IOCs, and that is what it's all about. So as I like to say, my mission is to move the conversation away from fear towards hope. And in my book that you saw earlier in CyberCon, I've studied the fact that hypervigilance is a biological condition. It is one step below the fight or flight response. And that fight or flight response is a very important biological condition that we cannot escape. We don't have a choice. When we're threatened, our bodies are awash in biochemicals that change the way we behave and act. So as we sling fear, there's a risk that we trigger hypervigilance in our organization, which creates something called fatigued fear-based complacency. This is a well-studied phenomenon where people give up. They say, you know what? We're just going to get hacked. It's going to happen. There's nothing I can do. I just know we're going to get hacked at some point. And they are so desperate to escape fear that they start to relax into the idea that once it happens, they'll be free of fear. This is not where you want your employees to be. So we want to help you transform, and I hope that this keynote today and the conversation to follow is really going to help you move away from this idea of it being about individual fear towards collective hope, turning away from the idea of cybersecurity as a technology problem and embracing the idea that we need human solutions, things that we do voluntarily that empower our team and really do bring truth to the idea of bringing behavioral science and cybersecurity together. And if you're interested in learning more, we can certainly show you in our booth. So drop by, our virtual booth is there. We'd be delighted to see you. I'll also hang out if you have individual questions or things you'd like to talk to me about. I'll make sure I come and hang out for a few minutes and I'll be there for you. But as I say, if you're interested, you can let us know. But the point of today's keynote really was just to share our perspective on a changing world and to help you do better at cybersecurity. So if you're interested, I'd love to have a conversation. Any questions or comments? And with that, Jacqueline, I'm going to turn it back to you with my sincere thanks for having me today.
That was excellent. Thank you very much for doing this presentation. Very great insight. And thank you so much again for April for her contributions as well. I am a moderate myself, so spirit
a moderate
animals.
What though? Which one are you?
I'm a moderate. Yeah.
Which moderate though? Which style? Which quadrant? Moderate, risk.
Moderate risk.
Risk. No, but which one? Moderate, risk, breaker. I can't remember which one you were because it's one of the quadrants. So remember, moderate is just the modifier. So I think if I recall, you were a moderate risk breaker.
Yes, I was.
That's it. So you're a moderate risk breaker. So there you go. So good. All right.
Now we do have a question in here.
Sure.
So let me just squeeze that in while we still have a few minutes. So we have one from Alex. Can someone be trained to move from one quadrant to the next?
No. And that is because your personality is endemic. So we can teach you to modify tendencies and instincts arising from your personality. So in psychological terms, we can create adaptability where you bend and flex towards other quadrants. We do that by educating you on the differences between your styles and impulses and instincts in one quadrant compared to another. Any of you who've taken Myers-Briggs or DISC know that the biggest benefit of that typically is teaching you how to interpret other quadrants rather than your own and not being dominant in terms of your style. The other thing is many of you'd be horrified. So if you decide to go through, and if you wish, by the way, if you go to our virtual booth, they can arrange to give you access to the quadrant for your training, which you might find interesting. What you got today was just the assessment. If you'd like to take a peek at your own quadrant, just drop in at the booth. The interesting thing about it is for your own training, you'll love it. And then if you're doing due diligence on our product, and we've had this with a number of clients, when they do the training in the other quadrants, they're horrified. They go, are there people who really do this? Are you kidding me? Are there people who have to be told that? Like, so each of the quadrants, the style, the language, the examples, it's all very personalized to the quadrant deliberately. So everybody's journey through it and reaction to it will be endemic to their style. So the answer, Alex, quite simply is no. So we can teach you to adapt, but we can't actually erase your core instincts.
Great, thank you. And we have Wendy who's popped up who wanted to give you the comment. Thank you, very interesting points.
Great, thank you, Wendy. I appreciate that very much. And I don't know what style you were, Wendy. Are you prepared to tell us? I'd be really curious.
Maybe Wendy can meet you at the booth and share it there.
All right, good.
Awesome. Well, we only have a couple minutes left, so let's wind down. So thank you so much, Dr. James Norrie, for your presentation. So everyone, what's going to happen right now is you're going to be taken back to the lobby. We encourage you to take this time to visit our exhibitor booths. We also highly encourage you to keep on with the MISA hunt, get all of your points in there. I see you guys doing a great job with that already, so keep that going. And I'm also going to be encouraging you to make sure you come back to our sessions that will start at 2:30. Once again, thank you so much, Dr. James Norrie, for this great presentation.
My pleasure. Everyone have a great day and enjoy your conference. And thanks to MISA and to the sponsor for having me today.
Thank you so much. Take care.